Bonjour à tous et
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this session concerning the state at the helm of the economy. With us, we have here in the studio Karien van Gennep. Good afternoon. You're the CEO of ING Bank France, and you're also co-chairperson of the Financial Association for the Promotion of Gender Parity in the Financial Sector. We also have Jean-Louis Girodollè. You're General Manager of Lazard France. You have a lot of experience in advising large companies in terms of M&A. You also worked for a while in the Ministry of Economy, and this will be very interesting for us today. Online with us from Finland, Olli REHN. Good afternoon. Great European figure, Governor of the Bank of Finland. You were European Commissar for 10 years in charge of economic affairs, and you were also Minister of Economy in Finland. We stay in Finland with Eeva FURMAN. Good afternoon. You're at the head of the Environment Policy Center in Helsinki, and you do a lot of work on governance and sustainable environment, especially for the UN. We also have Chakib BENMOUSSA. Good afternoon, Your Excellency, Ambassador of Morocco to France, and also President of the Special Commission on the Development Model. You're an engineer also by training. We also have Henrik ENDERLEIN from Berlin. You are professor at the Hertie School of Governance, and you're also at the Jacques Delors Institute in Berlin. I will give the floor to the coordinator of the session, member of the Cercle des économistes, and president of the France Strategy Institute, SAINT-ETIENNE. Well, to think about the economic action of the states, we must first of all remind everyone what is the notion of state, and say that this notion is not the same in the Anglo-Saxon environment and in France. The state is one of the most difficult concepts to understand and apprehend. Paradoxically, it is an invention that comes from the liberal political philosophy, because in the philosophy and the Marxist philosophy, there's a fusion between the two. So this is the result of a creation of the philosophers of the 18th and 19th century, based on the monarchies that were developed after the collapse of the Roman Empire in Europe. This notion of state is a notion that can only be apprehended if you make a distinction between a regalian state, a welfare state, and a strategic state. The regalian one is the one that maintains order, which is supposed to maintain order on the whole national territory. The welfare state after the Second World War is the one that ensures a minimum of solidarity between the various parts of the nation, and the strategic state it varies considerably depending on the countries and the times. There's one thing we should always remember. In the major Western countries, apart from France, nation preceded the state. So whether you talk about Germany, the UK, or the US, as the nation came before the state is an instrument of collective action. And as a simple instrument, it can very easily and without any oniric debate, it can be made more efficient. In France, it is the reverse. The state created the nation, and as the state is the mother of the nation, it's very difficult to optimize your mother, which makes the discussions in France extremely complex. And this explains why it's so difficult to talk about the major issue of efficacy in the role of the state. For a long time, there was a discussion on the weight of public spending in Europe, especially between countries where in Europe it's around 45 points of GDP, which is more or less the average in the Eurozone. Germany, 44 points. I'm giving you the figures before the COVID. And if you take this 45 points of GDP on average for Europe, 44 for Germany, but France stood at 56. And there was a major political discussion about the interest of having more or less public spending. While now the new discussion is more about the efficacy of this spending. To try and finish with this small introduction, if in France we had more public spending than the average of other countries, but if this came together with less unemployment, a better economic growth, a great training of young people, it would be a model. But the problem is if you spend 10 points more GDP than the others, and the youngsters leave their training without a diploma, you have a high unemployment rate, especially in the youngsters. It is an issue. So the main issue is efficacy. Efficacy, which was often looked at under the angle of economics, but now with the COVID crisis, it is also looked at from the angle of health, and we tried to see which states were efficient and which states were not. We spotted the fact that the states that were able to track and test and isolate the virus had a drop in their of about 7 points, while it was much more for those that were not able to do it. So when you look at public spending and the efficacy of the state, whether you talk about the state as a regalian state, welfare state, or strategic state, the main issue will be about this efficacy in the coming years, and this is what we're going to look at. Well, Olli, you're the governor of the Bank of Finland, and we would love to hear you on this issue of budgetary and monetary policies to try and counter the impact of the crisis and encourage economic development.
Thank you so much, and I'm very glad to be back at exam once or exam SAINT this time. I would have enjoyed meeting you all in person, and of course loved listening to my compatriot Kaija Saariaho's new opera piece. But maybe that's for the next time, or we may have to see that opera next year here, where I'm staying at the lake area in Finland at the Savonlinna Opera Festival. Anyway, I'd like to make 3 points on the issue of the role of the state during and after the crisis from the point of view of monetary policy and also fiscal policy. My first point is that in times of crisis, the state and public authorities, both government and the central bank, typically need to step up their roles to prevent large-scale economic and social human damage. The COVID-19 crisis is unprecedented both in terms of its global reach and its depth. Therefore, there is a clear case for sizable, substantial public support, both to contain economic damage and to stabilize the financial turbulence, and to pave the way or lay ground for a solid, strong recovery. However, in my view, the increased role of government should and can only be temporary. In due course, we should return to the preferable balance of the European social market economy, effectively combining entrepreneurial dynamism and social justice, or if you like, competition and market forces with regulation and redistribution. We need that also because we need sustainable, strong growth also to reduce the elevated higher level of public debt after the crisis. How well has Europe's policy response so far followed such a, say, crisis manual? One of the key lessons of the past crisis is that one must resort to an overwhelming force in monetary policy to contain financial market panic and to prevent an economic collapse. And that's my second point. As a response to the COVID-19 crisis, Europe has embarked on unprecedented monetary stimulus, while corresponding fiscal stimulus should be on its way. Hence, in monetary policy, we are practicing what we have learned from the previous crisis. And that's fully consistent with our price stability mandate for now and in the near future. In the medium term, the effect of the corona crisis is clearly disinflationary rather than inflationary. Besides, the danger of deflation has recently re-emerged. And this justifies the forceful monetary policy accommodation by the European Central Bank, which is both proportionate and necessary, to use the language of the Bundestag. The ECB's strong monetary policy stimulus is providing plenty of breathing space for European economies that suffer from the crisis and legacy problems. Now it is essential that the EU member states use this breathing space thus provided as a window of opportunity to pursue structural reforms and improve their growth potential and the resilience of their economies. This would also help pave the way for the overdue economic, ecological transformation towards a more competitive, sustainable and digitalized Europe. My third and my last point is that in addition to monetary policy support, stronger fiscal stimulus is needed. In this regard, the Midsummer European Council was a disappointment. Recent diplomatic actions, however, give a reason to expect that leaders of the European Union should be able to agree on a European Recovery Fund soon. Combined with the individual member states' fiscal stimulus, like Germany's 130 billion fiscal package, this would reinforce the recovery in Europe and better share the burden with monetary policy. However, it is of paramount importance to use the fiscal stimulus for the intended purposes for healthcare and employment and for sustainable development and digital transformation. Using the funding on new permanent spending items would be against its intended goals. So let me conclude to stick to the time limit. While the crisis is hitting hard the whole of Europe, in fact it's hitting the whole of Europe very hard, the south and the north, it is also a chance to make genuine progress. This window of opportunity to enhance economic and ecological transformation should be seized, should be made use of and not missed this time. Thank you very much for your attention.
Merci beaucoup, Olli REHN.
Thank you very much, Olli REHN. Let me turn to Eeva FURMAN. We heard Olli REHN tell us about sustainable growth. You're still at the head of the Environmental Policy Center in Helsinki. How can we regain our sovereignty, both in terms of economics and political sovereignty?
Now I can't hear you.
Can you hear me? Did you hear me? Can you hear me, Mrs. FURMAN? Okay. Okay. Well, let me ask you the question again, says the moderator. You're at the head of the Environment Policy Center in Helsinki. How can we regain this economic and political sovereignty to aim at sustainable growth?
Question, and as Mr. REHN, I would also like to thank for the opportunity to be here. For me, it's the first time, and to participate this panel with the distinguished co-panelists. I come from a different angle. I have a background in natural sciences, and my expertise lies in sustainability science. It is, however, closer actually to my co-panelists and the discussion we are having here than you could think. And today, human civilization has actually taken over the entire planet, and we are living in a so-called Anthropocene, which means that human and natural sphere are totally interconnected. And so we are living in one entity. And therefore, actually, when we plan economy, it automatically affects also the natural systems and vice versa. When something happens in natural systems, it affects the economy and actually the entire society. And this we have now experienced with the COVID-19 and with the crisis linked with it. So therefore, when we want to manage these challenges, we need to deal it as one, and this was a case. The COVID-19 crisis is really in the heart of that. So I find the question of sovereignty really crucial here, about the strategic sectors from the perspective of the Anthropocene. And I would refer the Global Sustainable Development Report, the GSDR, that was mandated by the heads of member states of United Nations in 2016 and was delivered at the UN summit last September. It brought the independent voice of science on how actually go forward for a resilient world and well-being. And here we don't separate the economy or society or the ecological state. It's all in one. And so in this report, we passed a clear message that instead of actually focusing in the individual sectors, we should really go beyond them and focus on the systems which pull together several different sectors. If you, for example, think about food system, we really see that it's not only a question of agriculture, but it's a question of water sector, forestry sector, economy sector, education sector, and so forth and so forth. And that is, in a way, much more natural what is happening in the society. And this really also came clear when we were talking about the food security during the COVID crisis. So my first point is that EU should really strive now to reorganize itself in planning, its budgeting and decision making, so that it structures instead of sectors on the broader sustainability-based approach and acknowledges the interlinkages and takes this really into account. And this is really crucial, that every step taken now when the COVID crisis is supported financially, that there is nothing that is not in line with the sustainable development goals, which are highly emphasized in the European Union. So this report, the GSDR, actually brought up 6 different societal systems that are so crucial for us. So that needs to be transferred into a sustainable stage. And these are all really crucial also in the post-COVID stage. And the first one is to build sustainable food systems and healthy nutrition, pay attention to food chains, food loss, and human health. The second one, achieving energy decarbonization and universal access of energy. Third one, promoting sustainable urban and peri-urban development in a science-based and citizenship-based manner. Here comes actually the sovereignty. And then the shifting towards sustainable and just economy is so crucial with circular economy and with sharing the externalities and benefits in the big and long flows that we are having, and strengthen human well-being and capabilities in a way that it's sustainable in broad sense. And then finally, sustaining the global environmental commons, because actually all the previous ones are totally connected to that and so crucial to everything, also economy. So my second point is actually that if we want to make progress with the Agenda 2030, with everyone on board in a broad sense, not only the government and not only the shareholders serving corporations, but governance, business, investment, individual behavioral change, collective action, and technology and science, they should all actually be integrated and work in an integrated way towards the same direction. That's the way of developing efficiency, as was talked in the moderator's introduction. So my third point actually is that when Europe then encourages sovereignty for its actors in these 6 societal systems, and this is very much strengthened now during the COVID crisis, is that actually the actors that are outside the European territory should be actually taken into account in this. And because we are connected with the flows of goods, people, money and information so strongly worldwide. So instead of closing, we should really open up. And there is, for example, the Africa strategy on the way and so forth, and work towards resilience together with the world. My final point is that although what is said may sound naive, it's still the way we should really move forward. Of course, it requires high strategic approaches, because we know that there are many global actors that have different kind of agendas than the European Union and the Agenda 2030. The economy has its own ways of functioning, and so does ecology. But today the society really needs them to be considered together. And thus the world is messy, and the next normal, to be really resilient, we need to ensure that we do not provide sector-based solutions by economists or by natural scientists, but rather build together in a multi-actor and interdisciplinary manner system-based path towards a sustainable Europe and the world. And finally, I would still like to emphasize that this COVID crisis, the economy that is now, or the finances that are used to deal with the crisis should really be in the line with the sustainability transformations, as Mr. REHN also pointed out. So thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. So, yes, we have clearly understood the requirement to think global. ENDERLEIN, the stakeholders outside of the European Union, how can we make the European Union into a sovereign power faced with China and the United States when they're in a Cold War and they're subsidizing their strategic companies massively? Thank you. First of all, it's a pleasure to be with you. I'm actually not far from Aix-en-Provence, and I've decided to sit in front of the window so that those of you who are far from Aix-en-Provence this year can benefit from the view and the sound of the cicadas. So, yes, is there such a thing as a European state? You're talking about nation states, you're talking about the states that preceded the nation or the contrary. Today, when we talk about Europe, we raise the question, as to whether it has the constitution of a state or whether it can be considered as a state. And in a few words, I would like to come back over this and question the role of Europe within this crisis. We've already touched upon this, but I think it would be good to develop it. So when the COVID crisis began, this is the first point, people said that Europe was not living up to what was required of it. There were very few actions of stabilization, of intervention, very little coordination. For the first time, for a very long time, we saw the borders closed down between Germany and France, which was a very disappointing moment for all Europeans. But now, 2 or 3 months down the road, we see that Europe has acted in the crisis. We've seen that something is arising that I would call a federalism by exception. So a time when a state is constituted when there's a crisis. We saw that in the Euro crisis, where Europe really came together during that time. And we can see it now in the COVID crisis, where there are more federal impulsions which are becoming more visible within the European institutions when it's needed. So a second point, if we come back to math grade with 1959, we learn all of this in our political economy lessons. Redistribution of resources and revenues as a second function, and regulation of the economic context. And when we see what Europe has done since the beginning of the crisis, and here we can talk about regulation of the economic situation, of course, the states also all acted in an independent and coordinated manner, but it's above all the European Central Bank, which gave a very strong impulsion. We must congratulate the European Central Bank for this. It's the only institution truly federal institution at the European level. There's a majority vote, and Irene, who I say hello to, knows this very well. So it really acts like a state institution. The second aspect is the redistribution of revenues, and this is where Europe has made the most progress in recent weeks, with the idea and proposal, first of all, a French-German proposal, and now that is adopted by the European Commission, of creating a real fund for stabilization and redistribution within the Eurozone. So we have experienced a symmetrical shock, but with asymmetrical effects throughout the Eurozone. And the idea of creating a European debt that can be used to mitigate the shock and help individual citizens within all of the Eurozone to face up to this crisis, whilst creating a green and digital economic boost, which is well balanced among the states. And we've created practically state functions that I myself call the beginning of a Hamiltonian moment. We're talking about referring to the constitution of the American Federation, with the ability of issuing a common debt. And that's what Europe is doing today. So that step, it remains a metaphor, of course, because we cannot compare the history of Europe today with a Hamiltonian moment directly, but it is an important step that Europe has taken towards a federal position in recent years. Third point, the allocation of resources. I think this is where Europe can work even more. It's the area where we can be more present. It's regulation, the single market, and this is where we see that there are nationalistic trends that are reappearing when Europe has to defend this common regulation. But the point that Masquet often insisted upon to describe the state was also the creation of public goods. This is where Europe has even more work to be done. There are very few European public goods, and we really need to work on this subject. The third point, and to conclude this brief introduction, Europe, if it wishes to come together as a more state-like entity, must help us to govern our economies and our markets, and must also have a far more international profile. We saw, and this was your introductory question, faced with China and the United States, what is the role that Europe must play? Well, Europe must clearly show itself to be the single pathway towards international trade, but also in the production of medical resources. We talked about masks, everything we need to fight against an epidemic such as COVID-19. And this is where Europe so far has not yet properly found its place on the international market. Far too much is done at the level of each state. So to conclude, we've taken a small federalist Hamiltonian step with Europe coming together as a real state, and I congratulate them for this. But to the contrary, when we saw the borders closing down and a lot of national responses, we see there's a long way ahead of us. And I hope that this federalism by exception will be increasingly strong. And outside of Europe, Mr. BENMOUSSA, your ambassador in Morocco to France, in terms of the development of countries, how can the state help the economies to invest, and with what funding? Thank you very much. I'm very happy to participate in this panel. I would like to share a few points with you, and above all set the context, and that is the role of the state in the economy, which can vary according to the level of development of each country, because the perception of risks, be they at the country level, sector level, or project level, the importance given to the long term as compared to the short term, the very level of maturity of the players, and in particular of the private sector, can mean that the state role can differ. A second point is also linked to this post-COVID period, where we are seeing the need for a state, but maybe a state that is different, a state that protects, that can take action and regulate better than it has in the past. So a few brief points I would like to share with you how a country such as Morocco, how the position of the state in a country such as Morocco. First of all, by underlining that the need for a new development model, and this was felt well before this health crisis. And the pandemic has merely reinforced this feeling. And this feeling came from the initial finding that tremendous progress has been made in recent years in countries such as Morocco. But despite this progress, which were effective thanks to the leadership of His Majesty, the King, we can see that the growth is slowing down. It's around 3.5%, which is the average over the past decade, whereas it was around 5% at the beginning of the 2000s, with fewer job creations with regard to the number of people coming into the job market, and maybe the growth does not mitigate the social and territorial inequalities sufficiently. Hence, through the creation of a special commission on the development model that I chair, we understood the need to think about this in the long term, and to do it with a participative approach as broad as possible, and a co-construction, and an approach which is simultaneously analytical, which allow us to organize a model that meets the challenges, but is based on the assets and advantages of the kingdom and the opportunities. I think it's very important through different approaches to work on the acceptability of this model, to move towards a new social contract, so that we may take sufficiently into account the medium and long term, and to include in this model the structural transformations which are now necessary. The third point I wish to develop was to share with you the experience of Morocco as a strategic and welfare state. And we can compare this with the average of OECD figures in terms of total expenditure of the state. In Morocco, the total state expenditure is around 40% of the GDP. The state has launched a certain number of voluntary policies. I can quote two or three very quickly. An industrial acceleration plan, which means that Morocco was able to progressively climb up the value chain, and in particular that of the automobile industry, where Morocco, in the space of a few years, has become a key player in Africa within this sector, with a production capacity of 600,000 vehicles. And this sector has now become the first exporting sector for Morocco. And there's the installation also of R&D companies in this sector in Morocco. The second is a voluntary action on behalf of the state, which has very important actions, is the energy transition towards renewable energies. And the state has set an objective for a level of renewable energies which should be equivalent to that of electrical power, and by 2030. So this has created extremely interesting dynamics around public-private partnerships within this sector, and is allowing us progressively to develop a substantial economic and educational sector and research and development. A third example where the state has intervened in recent years in quite an extensive manner is in the social fields, where we have launched a certain number of social programs. I can quote the National Initiative for Human Development, launched in 2005, or a health program for the underprivileged, or social cohesion funds that have been established and which allow us to mitigate the effects of inequality, to fight against poverty and social exclusion. But these approaches have also reached their limits, because we can see that growth is insufficient to absorb the needs in terms of number of jobs that are required. And this makes us think about the effectiveness of public spending. And ECO in Morocco is at a level of a 7, as compared to a level of 4 for similar countries. And there is a level of debt also, which means that we need to develop other sources of funding, be it in terms of attractiveness, foreign direct investment, the mobilization of public-private partnerships, or regarding more innovative approaches in terms of financial projects. So I do apologize, but we will ask you to end there, because we must finish going around the table. So we drew the attention to 2 or 3 points. First of all, to say that digital technology is changing the game, and maybe it raises the question of the place of the state and the manner in which the state expresses itself. The question of territory, which I think is key in terms of sustainability and the capacity to create the necessary foundations for the development of the country. And finally, all of the strategic partnerships with the countries of the region, and for the case of Morocco, in particular with Morocco and Africa, given that there is a true interdependency and complementarities that can be reinforced and can allow us to meet common challenges. Thank you very much for giving us a very thorough overview. Now I will turn to our banker, Karien van GENNIP, who is with us in the studio. You chair ING Bank. According to you, how can the state contribute to recreating a climate of confidence as a complement to what the private sector can do?
What states and what companies' responsibilities are, I think we need to first realize what was happening with us in the crisis. We suddenly realized how vulnerable we are. We thought we were invincible. We have taken peace and prosperity for granted. Nothing was going to stop us. And it did. A sudden crisis. But we must also realize that crisis management has almost become the new normal. 15 years ago, a no in the Netherlands and France, the European Constitution. I was in politics then. That was a big shock. 10 years ago, the financial crisis. We still remember that well. 5 years ago, the Accord de Paris, where we became really aware about the impact of climate change. And today, a big health crisis. We've also learned in the last couple of months how well we are able to adapt. Our speed and our magnitude of change is incredible, and we can do it as human beings. But we've also seen a tendency to isolate ourselves, to say we have to be self-sufficient, where I really truly believe we have to do this together. We have, whether it's trade, whether it's combating the virus, whether it's economic restart, we have to do that together. And through all this, for years, we've been living this crisis of trust, where the middle class has lost trust in our leadership, but also a crisis of inclusion. And with Black Lives Matter as the latest very visible form of that, we see that this inequality, this not having inclusion, is really taking a toll at our societies. So we need to rebuild our societies. We need to renew our social contract. And this is the time to do it. It's easy to say never waste good crisis, but it is what we need to do. And for me, there are 4 big questions trying to get out of this crisis. The first one is, the answer is green. It is not either economic recovery or sustainability. The way out of the crisis is a sustainable way. The second one is, we need to step up our inclusion. And we have to be honest about it. If I look at the panelists, it's not 100% all very white, but it's nearly there. We have to be honest. We cannot do that any longer. And at least on gender equality, there is awareness. And we have the index PENICO here in France, but we need to get further on inclusion of all different forms, and maybe we need an index PENICO for all different types of diversity. The third one is about financial responsibility. As companies, to make profit, to reinvest in our innovation, in our clients, but we also need to pay our taxes. That's what we need as individuals. And when we pay our taxes, we can expect the state to use our taxes well, to actually invest in schooling, in education, in healthcare, and do that well, do it effectively. And the first question is about what the role of companies is in society. What is our added value in society? What is our purpose? It's easy to say that, but if we define it top down, it's never a real purpose. It has to come bottom up, and we need to do it with our whole ecosystem. We've already moved from shareholders to stakeholders, but we need to go one step further and really include our whole ecosystem in what we are as a company, what our value added is. And then when you look back at any crisis, you know that what you do in a crisis will determine your success as a company or as an individual for years to come, or as a government. And what I really hope is that I can look my teenage daughters in the eyes when they ask me, my grandchildren maybe in 25 years, what were you doing in 2020? Did you actually rebuild the society? Did you renew the social contract? And did you do it in a more sustainable way, in a more inclusive way, in a more agile way? And did you make that happen and play a part?
Jean-Louis Girodolle, je me tourne vers vous à présent, vous qui dirigez Lazard France.
Jean-Louis Girodolle, I'm going to turn to you. We've just saw with the previous speaker thank you very much. I would like to thank you for your invitation, and I would like to greet the members of this roundtable and those who are remote. With regard to your question, we mustn't forget that, first of all, we had to start by funding the stabilization of the European economy, and that already has consumed considerable amounts. I would like to recall a few figures that were already given by Christian SAINT-ETIENNE. In the European Commission, the budgetary deficit, the cumulative deficit of the European Union, which was minus 0.6% of the European GDP last year, will move up to minus 8.5%. We know that Germany will be minus 5, minus 6. France will be above minus 10. And so these are considerable amounts. And it's at the starting point, it's within this context that we can talk about funding transformation. So we can approach this question from 3 different angles. The first is, what can we fund? What means do we have available? What are our funding capacities that already exist? The second is, within this transformation, what do we want to finance? What is the transformation? And the third thing is, who must do this? Who must finance this European transformation? Firstly, what are the funding capacities? I would like to state two findings, which are corollary. The first is that we are within a low-rate environment, which will remain low, which is a favorable factor to fund this transformation. You know that the European Bank is zero for funding and less than zero on a day-to-day. You know that the rate is 0 to 0.5, and the ECB has decided to buy back the assets, which has helped Europe, including for the most fragile, vulnerable economies, to achieve more convergence. These rates are very interesting because they're seen as we consider they will be low in the long term. Why? Because we don't anticipate any inflation. The inflation should be 0.3% this year, according to the ECB, and 1.1 next year and 1.3 in 2020. So what Sanui calls the 10-year break-even inflation rate, when that's is 1.3%. Therefore, we are in a sustainable environment in which inflationist pressures are contained, which can allow us to maintain low rates. Why is the inflation low? Because there is a lot of unemployment, and this will grow. And the reserve army of the unemployed will weigh heavily on salaries, because the cost of energy is contained due to the fact that we're using less oil in the energy, and there is the oil sector in America, which is exerting pressure, and therefore we have these negative inflation rates. And when we look at the curve, France is at 0 in 10 years, it's at 0.6% in 30 years, and German interest rates are entirely negative, even up to 30 years ahead of us. Why is it like this? It's because we're in an environment where there is a lot of savings, and the European Union, the Eurozone, has a net current account, which is very positive, rate which is very positive. It is something like 2.5% of the GDP, despite the deficits for the 3 coming years. So we are faced with a phenomenon where capital is abundant, it is ready to be invested, and it can allow us to invest at many things. There's not just public capital, there are also private investors. When we look at the amounts that the investment funds have raised in recent years, and that is the savings, and these savings that are abundantly available and which have been handed over to private investors, the investment funds, even just for Europe from 2018 to date, raised more than 250 billion euros to invest in Europe. They raised more than 100 billion euros to invest in infrastructure. We know that when they invest half of this money which is raised, and half is made from debt. So we can multiply by 2 the figures I've just given to give you an idea of the capacity and the investment power that this represents. So the good news is that today there is a funding context within Europe, an imbalance between investment and savings that leaves room for a lot of investment, and interest rates that will remain very low to fund this. So what do we want to finance with this money that is available? We know that we're at a time where a tremendous number of ideas have been put on the table, and where I believe that we have to refocus the debate. The first thing, we talked a lot about relocating, because we saw that during the health crisis that in Europe we did not have either the stocks nor the production capacities and the supply chains that allow us to cope with the epidemic. Can we bring everything back to Europe? Of course not, and that's not what we should seek to do. We mustn't forget that globalization has had positive effects. And we know that this has allowed hundreds of millions of people to pull out of poverty elsewhere than ours. Globalization came along with lower prices, because we turned towards the most competitive countries. So we can't relocate everything, because it would create tremendous losses for companies who've invested heavily abroad and for consumers who would see increased prices. So we must be selective. This selectivity gives a chance to the European Union the countries where the prices are the lowest, the south of Europe, Greece, Romania, Bulgaria, they're countries for which this relocation movement, thanks to competitivity, will create opportunities, and this can allow us to balance out development in Europe. So what will us be selective about? Everyone can have their own idea, but I will share mine with you. There are two words that we can rest upon to choose. The first is we need to look at resilience and competitiveness. Everything to do with resilience, we must focus on everything that's more strategic in a few essential value chains. This was said by a number of people. And of course, the first resilience that we seek today is that of climate change and the fight against climate change. So, of course, there's everything related to the energy transition, transport, construction. It's obviously health. We've just coming out of a health crisis, so it's everything that can help us to consolidate our supply of health equipment and material. It's technology. We know that Europe is running very late with this. We can be subject to technological shocks through attacks, cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, that we're lagging behind on. And on the side of competitiveness, as has been said, Christian SAINT-ETIENNE said it at the beginning, education. Education that Europe is lagging behind in, infrastructure, telecoms, and 5G. So who has to do that? Who should be doing this? First and foremost, Europe. It is the time for Europe. It is the relevant level. And as ENDERLEIN said, we might remember this point as the beginning of the federal Europe through the plan that was proposed today. And as the Commission today will no longer be just doing loans, but also direct transfers, it is a time for Europe to have its own resources. So a carbon tax at the borders with a distribution within the European Union, the tax on GAFAs. And Europe is even more legitimate in doing this because it will abandon a sort of naivety with regard to foreign investment, the policy of competition, a big program, research programs more directed at fundamental research. And the subject of today, the legitimacy of the states to intervene at a central level is questioned today. In France, we have an institutional system in which we today have the worst of both worlds. We have a Jacobin state that wishes to delegate its jurisdictions with the means that we have the decentralized authorities over which the Jacobin state is monitoring very closely. So we saw that in the crisis, in the elections, it is a local level that people want to see today. So who must do it and how must we go about it? So, of course, we can take a lot of out of what you said. One thing in particular is the need to have specific tax incentives. Also, we must think global, Eeva FURMAN, and go beyond the strictly sectorial logic and think global. How today, in the context we're in today, how can we conciliate these two approaches?
Who wants the floor?
Easy.
I think what is very important is first that we do it together. That is not either the state or the company. We really have to do it together. And then the second part that is really important for me is that as companies, we're not waiting for the state to move. It cannot be that we're waiting for the state to put regulations in place so that there is a level playing field. That is clear what sustainability standards are. That is clear what can stay in France or in Europe. As companies, we have a responsibility as well to define what we think is important and to act upon it. And we cannot wait for the state. And the second point, and I'm very happy you mentioned that, we have to be very careful that we continue to be an open society. And that we continue to do trade, that we continue to work at our economic recovery together, not just inside of Europe, but also with all the actors outside of Europe. And there the state needs to take the initiative.
Et aussi peut-être pour gagner ce...
And maybe also to see what Mr. BENMOUSSA was saying, the issue of social acceptability and the issue of European democracies that have to understand and accept the fact that there is a political risk at present that should be integrated. Henrik, ENDERLEIN. There is some echo, so please can you repeat your question? Yes, my question was about social and political acceptability of the state intervention, which is spending a lot of money, putting a lot of money into the economy, and this represents a major issue for citizens and Europeans. Is there a risk that should be identified at that level? Is this an issue that the governments and EU should work on? Well, look at the alternative and look at the US, where a lot of people queue to get some unemployment because they have no welfare state. So if we have a choice of, on the one hand, stabilizing the economy and on the other hand, not doing anything, the choice is easy. And if we talk about the debt level, I come from Germany, and Germany has insisted a lot on stabilizing in its debt, not going over 60% according to the Maastricht Treaty, or even and not going to 90 or 100%. You should not only look at this debt, but see how you can pay it back and aim at long-term economic stability. If you look at what the Federal Republic of Germany is doing, we were always told that Germany was too strict and not spending enough. And today with the crisis, this is the country that is spending most in Germany and that has the most leeway. So one should make sure that when everything is, they have applied the policy according to which when all is going well, you should put money aside to be able to spend it when things go wrong. Mr. Girodolle, yes, you were asking about the legitimacy of the massive public spending and public intervention. This should correspond to two criteria. First of all, efficacy. This money comes from taxpayers, whether from today or tomorrow, and this represents a demand for efficacy. As we heard earlier about this needs reform of public governance and the major issue of state efficacy, which is a major demand in France. And the other thing which is important is solidarity. If you look at carbon taxes, we saw the issue of the yellow jackets, for example. These new public policies that are implemented are going to cost something to someone. They're going to cost because prices are going to go up, and those that are most impacted and that are victims have to be listened to and compensated for. The carbon tax has to be used, for example, to improve the situation of the people it's going to weigh upon in the EU. A question from the public that is remote. For REHN, at the time when there are huge societal choices with a change in the digital world, etc., shouldn't we think of going back to some form of planning? Olli REHN, can you hear me? Can you answer that question? Olli REHN? I think we lost the connection with Olli REHN. Lost the question, the connection. Eeva FURMAN, can you answer that question to stay in Finland?
As a whole, I would rather say a few words connected to that, from the fact that actually people have realized during this crisis that the populist ideas earlier are not are not anymore supporting the people, and therefore I think we are moving to a direction where actually resilience could be strongly the basis of planning of the state as a whole, of the nations, but also of the businesses, and move forward in a way to that direction instead of efficiency, because actually the situation has really put all the different parties into risks, not only those that are vulnerable, but also those who made big revenue earlier, even the state. So I see that the direction also in the planning should be much more on the resilience instead of efficiency. And this means rethinking the different supply chains, the production chains, and so forth.
Chakib BENMOUSSA sur cette question de la planification.
Chakib BENMOUSSA on this issue of planning, very quickly. Absolutely. This long-term issue means that the stakeholders have to be able to be mobilized, have to have a direction, and the interest of this strategic reflection over the long term is absolutely uppermost. I would like to insist on one point that was mentioned: the link between Europe and the neighboring countries, in particular countries south of Europe. I'm thinking that very often these countries are viewed as problems, even though they could offer solutions. I'm thinking, for example, in terms of crisis, but also safety or security, migration, competitiveness of the global economy. And the fact that they may have a different vision, a different view, could come as a strategic partnership and open new alleys to bring new answers to common challenges. Christian Saint-Etienne, you are the coordinator of this session, and you have the heavy responsibility of concluding this rich discussion.
So, if I have just 1 minute, maybe even two, I think that if we summarize the different presentations, what was clearly said is that we must remain in an open world that favors inclusion and sustainable development. And if we were to take home 3 words that we were to bring together in the coming years, coming weeks, coming months, it's resilience, inclusion, effectiveness. So we have to work with these 3 elements in order to attain a level of development. As the ambassador said, the role of the state depends on the level of development, but at each level of development, we must attain an economic development that favors inclusion and sustainable growth. It is not one or the other. It is by succeeding in sustainable development that favors inclusion that we will speed up our economic development. So think global. We come back to this. Yes, think global. Nevertheless, within the framework of resilience, we must, of course, be able to be autonomous with regard to essential questions such as health, technology, sustainable development. And we didn't talk about this a lot in the roundtable. It maybe was not the core point here, but Fabien, you said in your introduction, we've entered in a Cold War between 2 giants. We must remember that the United States plus China makes 40% of the GDP and very soon 60% of military expenditure. And both countries are getting ready for a possible military battle, which might happen in China, in the south, in Taiwan, or elsewhere. We've just seen what's happened in Hong Kong. It is an extremely harsh and violent signal, a very powerful signal. So it's within this context that Europe must be thought out and constructed. So a resilient Europe that favors inclusion and efficacy, effectiveness, but let's not forget that if we do not come together, if we do not consolidate Europe, it will probably be in a bad situation if China and America clash. So thank you very much for participating in this session, which was dedicated to the state at the helm of the economy. So it is 4:50 on the dot. Thank you very much.